Oh. Hello and welcome back to season 2 of Rez Dog Walkers. I can't believe we made a second season, but here we go. My name's Dallas Smith and I'm your podcast host. This podcast was created to talk about the benefits that can be had when First Nations, resource developers, and government work together in British Columbia and across Canada. When First Nations communities are healthy and have opportunities, we all benefit. I am elated to be here for episode 1 of season 2 to have my dear brother John Allen Jack joining us today. Chief Councillor of the Huu-ay-aht, Chair of the Alberni-Clayoquot Regional District, and I just found out Acting Chair of the Island Coast Economic Trust. Welcome to Rez Dog Walkers, John.
Well, thank you for having me, Dallas. It's great to be here.
So, just right in there, you're a busy man.
Fairly busy, yeah.
Fairly busy. You know, we're in Vancouver right now. We're getting ready for UBCM. I know this is probably one of the first places you and I met, probably 10, 12, 13 years ago as young First Nations leaders. I know that Huu-ay-aht was very progressive in dealing in the treaty process and got through your treaty. And I know you got to sort of be a bit of a protege to our dear, I like to call him Uncle now, Robert Dennis, just probably because it annoys him a little bit when I do that in a nice nephewy way. But we both kind of walked into this world and, you know, we met many years ago and we were both quiet men and now we have these jobs and we have these families. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Do a lot of talking now. It's definitely something that I had to learn, but something I think I'm okay at now. Yeah, definitely had a lot of mentors. Robert was definitely prime among all of them. It's been quite a journey, and I've seen that you've had quite a journey as well, not just professionally, but we're both family men now, eh?
Strange times now. I mean, first you clear your schedule, and first you create your schedule and you try to keep yourself as busy as you can, and then you start having chill. Well, first then you meet a significant other and, you know, you start factoring that into your prioritization of your schedules, and then the world continues to move and you start having children, and next thing you know you're heading to UBCM for a week and you're trying to figure out, okay, did I get all the lunch stuff for the kids ready for the week? Did I lessen the load on my partner so I can make it as easy as I can for her? How do you manage it all?
I don't sleep. No, I like to stay up a bit late and get all of those kind of things done. I am the type of person who likes to do chores while I'm thinking about stuff, so I do most of my reading during the day, but when I'm thinking, I do it while I'm doing the dishes or doing the laundry. I did 2 loads of dishes and some laundry before I left and grocery shopping. Hopefully my wife's in good shape, but it's definitely a new era. We got to make sure that we keep up, do our share everywhere.
Thank you. Definitely. I mean, I think of my dad taking care of me while he was working was giving me a bag of chips and a can of pop when he was sitting in the pub talking with everybody after the meeting. But times have changed, and I think that's awesome though, because we're raising not only the bar, but we're raising the floor on how we manage these issues.
It really makes me excited to see what these new generations, the Gen Z, Gen Alpha kids are going to be like, because both parents are part of their lives, like in higher proportion. Every cohort there is. I want to see what it looks like when fathers are present in their kid's life, and I think we're going to see that across the entire province, the entire country, and I'm excited to see what results in that. It's something that I think a lot of parents our age have committed to in their lives. I remember when my dad worked for McMillan Bodell, I'd see him maybe 2.5 hours during the day, unless I got up early and watched him leave in the morning on the crummy. You know, he'd get up and get on the old crew cab and head out to work. I think he was working in Buckley Bay at the time. He's a faller. So I have fond memories of being around him and with him, but he wasn't nearly as present as I would have liked, and he knows that too. I have a good relationship with him, but I definitely wanted to be there for my kids, all 3 of them. So yeah.
3 now. I've got 3. You've got 3. I've got 3 jobs. You've got 3 jobs.
It does feel like having 3 kids is a good number, at least 3. At least that's what my fellow councillors tell me, at least 3. Because we're Indigenous. We want to keep the lines going, and 3 is more than replacement, and I think that matters too. So it's a small thing, but I was glad we were able to do it. My wife came from a huge family, and I think she wanted a lot too.
Nice. So have you mastered kind of the AirPods with pushing on the swing? I know your kids are getting a little bit older where you're not necessarily pushing them on swings as much anymore, but
They're getting to a point where they know how to swing, and they'll kick me in the head if I don't pay attention.
nice.
So I'm taking the earphones out when I'm with them at the play park now. So I'm struggling to keep up, but I'm still doing it. So it works out.
Nice. I was playing street hockey with my daughter last week, and same thing. I got busy on the phone, and she just decided to take a shot and hit me. And I was on the phone, so I couldn't react the way I probably would have reacted, which was probably good in hindsight. But it was just one of those reminders, like, hey, I'm here playing with my kids. Put the phone away for a minute.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's not that easy, obviously. Some calls you have
Yeah.
to take, and some calls can wait a little bit. But have you learned that, you're starting to figure out how to manage that side of things, like how you prioritize not only just your day, but your hours, things like that?
Absolutely. I mean, I'm quite an introvert despite my ability to talk. That's a learned skill and it's a performance. It's not real. And
Well, you're a hell of a performer. And like I said, there's
Yeah.
not many people that I'm afraid to follow.
but I've always been a bit hard to get a hold of, and I kind of have done that on purpose because if it's important, I will hear about it. But if it is not, it will fall by the wayside. It comes off as passive aggressive, but it's just there are certain things that just don't warrant response unless it comes up in a meeting or that sort of thing. And changing some of the expectations at our workplace has really helped make it more parent friendly at the very least. And I think that's something that I've tried to maintain. So, for instance, we try not to have meetings before a certain time, usually about an hour when the office opens, just so people have time to get situated, but also so certain people who don't have to be in the office right away can drop off their kids. We have a few people, not just me, who do that in council, and we wanted to make room for that, especially when we have committee meetings with citizens. Um, and I find that it is a good strategy, not just for being parent friendly, but for hopefully doing more to draw more women into leadership as well. That's something that we've had some focus on lately. It's been quite important to get more representation on council as well as on committees. And it's something that we continue to endeavor to do. It's something that we support, and we'll probably keep doing that moving forward.
How do you not? I found COVID was both good and bad for that. I think COVID helped us realize that, it doesn't have to be an 8:30 till 4:30 in the office, hard regimented. But I think one of the challenges I've found coming out of COVID with the leadership in my communities is everybody just accepts every Zoom call they're given now, and the prioritization of the meetings we accept now is a bit of a challenge.
Yes, absolutely yes. I've found, and I must say that I'm one of those weird people who didn't ever really have a problem with COVID in terms of it being isolating.
Mhm.
I was like that anyway. But I know that that wasn't the case for a lot of people. I do find, though, that meetings have become the work, whereas meetings used to be setting up the plans to do the work. And so, in terms of getting things done, what I've tried to do and try to kind of show for other people in council, because we're pretty young, our council, compared to, there was definitely a generational shift at Huu-ay-aht, is it's not enough to show up at 8:30 to 4 every day and just kind of sit around. But it's also not enough to just do nothing but meetings, because that's not the work. So I've been, rather than having to-do lists, I do time blocking. I say, at this time, I'm going to be doing this. This time, I'm going to be doing this. I even put in like my lunchtime, and when I have a call with my wife, or if I'm picking up my kids, just so it's in the calendar.
Mm.
I'm better at that doing it in the work calendar. Sometimes I don't put it in my home calendar that my wife doesn't know, and that's not good either. I'll figure that out as time goes by, but it really comes down to you have to put time aside to do the work, doing your reports, making sure there's follow-up on things. The work of a counselor or or a chief counselor is different than somebody who's working in the office as an administrator, but I think the concepts behind it are the same, and I'm not always behind the eight ball now. I do have to declare inbox bankruptcy every once in a while, though. So I've done it, probably 3 times in the past X number of years I've been on council, but there have been times where I just send an email out to almost everyone and go, I'm deleting my inbox. There's over 3,000 emails in there, and if it's important, please email me back. If it's not, I read about it ages ago. I don't know if it was Amber MacArthur or one of those tech people, back when tech TV was a thing. And they said, if you have to, just do it. And people will understand. And more people understand now. It's still a new concept for some people. They feel like they have to chain themselves to the inbox and do all of that categorization. And sometimes it's important, but you have staff. And honestly, when you're in a leadership position, the fewer documents you handle yourself, the better. Because you want to rely on other people to do the real administrative work, or else it gets muddied. And then suddenly I'm fixing the photocopier because I know how, and
Or maybe it's a nice distraction from everything else.
I've been spoken to by one of my mentors about that, actually. My first 4 years or so as a counselor, I was an office guy. I did everything back before I was on council. So I was the one who knew how to use the projector, fix the network, fix the photocopier. So I would, and thought I was doing good. And my mentor is Angela Wesley. She said, John, you're a council member now. You really have to focus on what you're doing as a counselor. And she did it.
Very anti-way.
Yeah, and I was leaning into the photocopier, changing toner. And she looked at me and then said all of that. And then I realized at a certain point that it doesn't matter if you can do the job better. You have certain jobs in front of you, and you have to learn to rely on people to do the work, even if you think you're better at grammar or something, right? And we do that now. And there's a learning process, but that's how a teamwork happens. And I think we get more done as a result. You have to look at it at a wider scale. Mm-hmm. Just because I can check things off on administrative tasks, maybe that's not the best use of my time. And I think that was a learning process early on, but it helped reinforce proper roles and responsibilities and governance. And that's become very important for Huu-ay-aht, especially now that we're doing so much.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. I think we've had to evolve how we do things because what we're doing is evolving.
Yeah.
I mean, you and I were at the Indigenous Forestry Conference in Port Alberni week before last week sometime. And I talked about how the fact that last time I was in Port Alberni, I think I was 11, 12 years old, and I was with my dad at an AFN meeting. And, Simon Lucas was there and all these old elders that, really helped open some doors for some things. But we've really seen things start to take off over the last generation or so. I know just Nemacolus and Huu-ay-aht have been working together in the same rooms on a lot of things, probably since Gordon Campbell first came to power.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then just watching to, what we were asking for compared to what we're doing now and how we've had to build some actual structure to do it is part of the fun of the journey, I think. I know I've been dealing with some health challenges, and so I've been trying to be a little bit more efficient with my time. And so I've only been doing keynotes lately. And that's awesome because you just prepare for that sort of thing. But then the reality came in and it's like, oh my God, we have this economic development corporation that needs monthly reporting. We have all these other things. And like you, I don't try multitask and do it all, but I need to trust my team to be able to do those things and make sure that I'm still receiving them. And there's still some process in place. So it's different challenges that we had compared to our previous leaders.
Absolutely. Although learning from those previous leaders was so central to who I am. And it's not just people from my own tribe, although people like Robert and Jeff Cook and so many others, Angela Wesley, Marge White. Within Huu-ay-aht, that was great. But also seeing the leadership and being introduced to the leadership in other nations, I think I learned the most in terms of real leadership from a fellow friend of ours, Ken Watts, Wamish. His father, George Watts, was central in everything that was going on in the Great Awakening in the 60s and 70s. And I only knew him in the last years of his life, and he ended up taking over chief negotiator for Monmouth, the treaty that we were a part of. And I got to spend a lot of good time with him. And he just made everything look so easy. The older generation, the memory like a steel trap, remember what things were said and when they were said. I wish I had that. I need a notebook, right? And learning so much from people like that and hereditary leaders from my nation and others, bringing it all together with my formal education was something that I still struggle with sometimes. Mm-hmm. I'm very much someone who feels like he's still coming from the westernized, educated kind of considerations of things. And thinking on that as I come in and interact with my own community, with other communities, realizing that I may be thinking a bit too colonially. So always checking myself on, okay, how would this normally have gone? And I find that we still have the right resources in place for that, the right knowledge keepers, the right wisdom. And it's just finding it and tapping into it at the right time.
You know, it's funny that you bring that up about those, you know, the old, I use the term old school. I know Corey Wilson and I were talking about when our dads used to travel around together and doing some of this work. And I also think of Simon, Lucas, and other people. They'd be sitting in the back of these meeting halls doing the crossword puzzle. But then all of a sudden something would come up and they just,
Yep.
And then they would just give this 7-minute speech that hit every point. And then they'd go back to their crossword puzzle.
Yeah.
Like the amazing, just able to be intuitive, but also relaxed. I mean, that was the other great thing that I know I soaked in from people like Bill Kramer and some of the people that I got to hang around with in the infancy of my political career. Just really helped me in a position where we just can't keep reacting. You know,
Yeah.
We can't keep reacting to things all the time, even if it's angry, even if it's happy. We just need to kind of accept things for what they are and be prepared for them, which is kind of my next segue. I mean, Huu-ay-aht Manuth Treaty, you mentioned that. I know I'm trying to get Angela to come join one of the upcoming episodes. I've started to work with her on Coast Funds.
Oh, great.
She's a board of director on the Coast Opportunity Funds that I'm chairman of. And so her and I have gotten quite close over the last little while. And I'm working with her also in her role as a BC Treaty Commissioner. I've taken on the role as chief negotiator for my tribe as my dad's transitioning out. So he's in his mid-70s now, and we're still under the hereditary system, and we're working with these different things. And so I'm transitioning into some of these different roles, and I'm so grateful that there's still some of this. Embarrassed. I'm going to piss somebody off, which part of the course, I tend to do that, John. I'm glad there's this older generation to kind of help keep me balanced. Some days I still feel like the young guy, like when you and I were in our early 20s and we just were so enthusiastic and ready to take on the world because we knew it. We can do this. We can do this. And then reality tempered that.
Yeah.
But now that I've gotten into a position where I'm not I'm not just recommending decisions, I'm starting to make them. I'm glad that I'm able to kind of look back and think of people like George Watts and Angela and other people who just, really paved a way for good decision making. I think that's one of the things that we've started to see on the island, specifically island and the coast, is there's some decisions that were made maybe even a generation ago that were made in a good way that helped to prepare us for the next steps. Maybe just a little bit on, what Huu-ay-aht's up to now. I know that's, one of your 3 jobs right now is chief councillor of Huu-ay-aht. You've got a treaty, but you've also got other interests. What's Huu-ay-aht doing in managing all that going forward?
Well, I mean, like you said, standing on the shoulders of giants at that point. The same thing happened in Huu-ay-aht back in the late 70s, early 80s is when the decision to change at Huu-ay-aht was made, and it was started with a core of hereditary leaders and people who were willing to work with them within the Indian Act system. So we achieved treaty over 20 years or thereabouts, and there's a whole story there. But really what it worked into was when we got into treaty, in the context that we did, under Gordon Campbell and Christy Clark at the time, really exploring the opportunities created by the new relationship idea, that a treaty wasn't just a divorce from the Indian Act, which it was, and that's great, but it was also the start of a new relationship, one in which we were hoping to really look at it from a government to a government perspective. But I think also importantly, not just on the governmental side, was making sure that we were making the connections that we weren't able to make in the previous time. So part of what we were really keen to do in that first treaty government was make those connections, to send the message that we were open to new relationships, open for business, and willing to do our part in creating value, because it was the sharing in new value that we saw as the real path forward for making all of the numbers work for Huu-ay-aht. I think this is common across a lot of communities. What keeps me up at night is a formula. It's how much we need over time to really do what we want. And that's our population growth. I mean, we just talked about that. Our population growth is over and above that of the rest of BC and Canada. Add on to that our desired increase in infrastructure and programs and services, catch up and keep up. And then inflation. and then the growth rate of the rest of BC and Canada. Because if you're going to catch up and keep up to those around you, you have to grow and develop faster than they do. But then you have to keep pace with them as they are growing as well. And while it may have slowed down periodically, it does pick up. And so we need to keep all that in mind. But that number is intimidating. That number keeps me up at night. It's a challenge, but it's also intimidating because we need to start thinking in terms of not just reliance on federal transfers and that sort of thing, but how do we benefit from unlocking the value in our lands and unlocking the value in our people and all of those things in between, because that's how we're going to leverage ourselves to grow, catch up, keep up, and beyond into the future. And I just realize I'm a certain step in that process, that it goes well beyond my lifetime, that the things I'm hoping to see may not happen until the next generation, when those alphas grow up to become fuller, more capable people because their parents, both parents, were involved in their lives.
Mm-hmm.
My job is to keep that stability and set the groundwork for that, and try to push things along the way in a way that helps us. And economic development has been a very important part of that. I think the connections we have made in economic development are what are going to sustain us and create stability outside of the governmental cycle, and the instability that can result in various electoral things. I mean, depending on when somebody's listening to this, we're coming into a provincial and a federal election, and things are going to change, I think, generationally now. And that is going to be a consideration for every Indigenous community, but especially Huu-ay-aht, especially nations with treaty, and anyone who's really thinking on that balance between the social aspects of development and the economic aspects of development, and keeping and remembering who you are. It's quite a balancing act, and it's something where we have to play to our strengths, I think. And I think the strengths that we're bringing, understanding our land, understanding the resources on our land, and coming into a point where we're starting to really develop our own people in a way that they're going to make opportunities for themselves. And how can we get out of their way and give them what they need to help them do that? Because it can't all be what our nation is going to do or the government is going to do. It's got to be about freeing those people to live the lives they want. And that's what keeps me motivated, I think.
I mean, it's just a natural segue into, it's not even an elephant in the room for me anymore. I really don't give a shit who wins on October 19th. I mean, I've got my own personal values that I'm going to vote with. I mean, as you know, I took a run in 2017.
Yeah.
Christy Clark decided, and I was complaining about her government so much, she challenged me to come help fix it.
Yep.
And I took the challenge and fell a little bit short. And so I've always been interested in the provincial politics, but I don't let it define what I'm trying to achieve for my nations anymore. And similar to you, I mean, we have different tools now. Between your nation and my group of nations, we're the biggest TFL holders on Vancouver Island now.
Yeah.
Between TFL 44 and TFL 64, which are joint Indigenous partnerships with Western Forest Products. I think one of the interesting things about the development of these initiatives is they weren't at the cost of anybody. As we're heading into this election propaganda, partisanship, whatever words we want to use, because I got friends on all sides of this equation now.
Me as well.
And so it's watching these things play out, and I'm like, wow, if that person gets in, I'm going to have to manage this way. If that person gets in, I might keep doing some things the same. What's kind of your thoughts heading into the election? We'll get into some of the specifics of each of the parties, but what's just your general thought from a Huu-ay-aht leadership point of view?
From a leadership perspective, from a Huu-ay-aht perspective, I think what I do often is try to explain to people who are new, and I won't touch my chest anymore, but who are new or aren't really thinking about the external relations aspect, is that the world is never going to end no matter who's in power. That you have to find the common ground to get things done. And what I like about how things have been in the recent past is that every party, no matter who they are, they have a load of people who are there to win, right? And to hold power. And that's going to happen no matter what. But there's always a core of these optimists, pragmatists, get things done people. And when you meet them, you get excited, and it doesn't matter who they are. And it doesn't matter what party they're from, because you know you can rely on them because they're thinking about, okay, we've won. Now what? And how do we get things done before it's over? And there are definitely people that I come to know coming up through the Harper and the Liberal era, BC Liberal era, that I really respected. I really liked Chuck Stroll. I really liked Jim Prentice and Peter Van Loan. Loads of people from that era who I really could see were getting things done on the conservative side. And I was very much on the Atleo side of the conversation during the Idle No More, where it was better to be in the room having conversations, tough ones, than not be. And so I was very much in agreement with that approach, and we took that forward, and I learned that from people like Robert, and learned how he got along with people in the Campbell government and later the Christy Clark government. I'm related to Christy Clark through marriage, so it was a little easier with her. But Mike DeYoung and Rich Coleman, a bunch of people I was able to have conversations with and really get to know and really see eye to eye with. And I came out of university, I had a left-wing swirl to me at the time. And, I had my backup until I started talking to these people and realizing there were people there who were there for the right reasons. And I've been able to internalize that and bring that forward. Because one person, and we'll probably talk about this later, one person I really got along with was John Rustad when he was Minister for Indigenous Relations, Reconciliation. I like to think that he would recognize me if I see him. But he's somebody I got along with and somebody who visited our community on several occasions. And I could go on and on that part. I could also talk well about the NDP side of things and the federal Liberal side of things. I don't think I will, but I think I love.
I think you might.
Interviewer. I just wanted to see. I don't want to jump the gun on that, but there are so many folks that I really, respect on the NDP side provincially. Josie Osborne, somebody who was in the room when I was stumping for you. Actually, it's before she was asked to run, and then she's been doing really well in every part that she's worked with. I've worked really well with so many ministers. As often as I've heard no from Rod Fleming, he's a guy that I have all the time in the world for. And although the forestry minister, Bruce Ralston, actually went on a international trip with him to help, bring that forward, show to Japan that BC forestry is dependable and we can compete with Russia and Germany and Finland if we have a little bit more investment, And so those are the types of things that I love untangling knots, and I think that's why I'm still here. And being able to have conversations with people who are also untangling knots, I think that's what gives me a lot of energy. And when you find those people, it's really good.
I think my journey is similar. Stan Hagen was kind of the first politician that I got to meet and text and talk to on a regular basis.
Oh, yeah.
And he started bringing me into the Liberal Party or the BC Liberals and starting to meet some of those exact same people. I think of George Abbott, who's kind of, but I'm not sure what George is doing. We'll have to get George on the show, I think, just to kind of catch up with him a little bit. But a lot of these agreements started with that early Campbell days. I mean, he came in and challenged the referendum because he had to unite the right to meet the NDP. And I'm trying to give John Rustad, who's also, I consider a friend, that latitude. He's posturing because he needs support to complete his vision.
It's silly season.
When the dust settles, I am pretty confident that we're going to sit down and have some pragmatic discussions about what's best for not only my territory, but what's best for British Columbia. And I know you're lining up to have those kinds of discussions with whoever gets in there. So I'm trying not to drink the Kool-Aid on, now that silly season starts. I mean, depending on when we get the editing done, this is going to drop, sometime after the writ goes.
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting because I don't have a clue who the clear-cut favorite is right now. And it doesn't even really matter who I like the most out of the three parties. I have to prepare myself in the nations that I work hard to represent to be in a position to have that discussion. But let's start. Let's start with the Conservatives. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of rhetoric around the Land Act.
Mm-hmm.
You and I have been intimately involved in the development of government agreements that will lead to something like the Land Act. The Council of the Haida Nation itself has won Supreme Court cases that have declared their title over their land. And so to acknowledge that through the Land Act was simply a no-brainer. But for people to politically take that and maneuver it into this fear-mongering that every First Nation is going to start telling every piece of private landholder how their land's going to be managed is a challenge.
Yeah.
What's some of your thoughts on that?
I parallel your thoughts. I think that I was more than willing to give time to the work that was being done, because I think what Indigenous communities across BC have been working so hard, laboring to do, is to prove not just to their own communities and to government that you can rely on us to understand the economy and what's important, but to work with people who are invested in that economy. And I think we have, and I think we've demonstrated that adding Indigenous voices to any of these processes, even though it reduces certainty, I think people are not really understanding that Indigenous communities are going to be a cornerstone of creating value in the future, because we're here. We're here for the long term. We have a real investment in the value as it's being created and sharing in it. And I think what we need to continue to do is help create those instances where we can show confidence in how things are going, and hopefully receive confidence back from the people we need to, not just government, not just other Indigenous communities, but business and business leaders and the general public as a whole. They need to see their leaders, their invested folks, demonstrate respect back to Indigenous communities, because we are still struggling with the old generational understanding that Indigenous communities oppose things.
Mm-hmm.
And in the chess game of rights and title, that was the case. I think we've won enough that we should start now shifting to demonstrating that our involvement with pieces on the table, with skin in the game, is not a threat to the British Columbia or Canadian economy, but is in fact something that will make it better. And I think what we need to do is get rhetoric away from people letting that get away from them on the Land Act or on the Haida decision or on all of these sorts of things, because the market, the economy, it runs on a bunch of things. But one thing that we often forget is that it runs on confidence. Mm-hmm. And our part in creating that confidence is very important. And I think what we need to do is, no matter who's in charge, demonstrate that we have confidence in the economy, in the end goal and objectives of what it is we're trying to do here in government, in Indigenous government, in local government, to help enable people live the lives they want to live, while also respecting some of the collective rights and responsibilities that we have as Indigenous communities. And that shouldn't be scary to anybody. I think during silly season, it'll be very easy to rely on that kind of scare tactic to get an easy win. Mm-hmm. But I do think we should walk down the path of some sort of situation where we're updating a Land Act, where we're updating how we do things, because they're over 150 years old in some cases. Mm-hmm. And I think we're ready to participate meaningfully in those processes, because we already want to participate meaningfully in the economy. And we've wanted to do so since the early 2000s, if not earlier. Mm-hmm. And so what will it take? And I think part of that is us thinking about the public relations aspect, not just the government relations aspect. We're almost there, I think.
Some days I would agree with you wholeheartedly, but I'm one of those morons who kind of deals with, well, I don't like the extremes of the left versus right. My career has been based on the extremes of conservation versus economic development, and we did our conservation first. It was important. We had the global attention in the Great Bear Rainforest, but trying to build an economy after you've already declared what you can and can't do is a challenge.
Yeah.
And so I've taken a different approach on Vancouver Island, where I've started to say, okay, while I'm protecting this, I need to develop the opportunity for this. But I think you're so right in, we just have to engage ourselves. I think the nations that have been a bit of ahead of the curve have known what they want. And that's really ideal because we've not only said, I want this, I want my children to be happy, I want to break these cycles. We've actually charted out paths for how we get there.
Yeah.
And I think that's a significant difference that the general public doesn't realize is there's lots of people who work around, leaders like yourself, myself, Ken Watts, other guys who are actually just helping to build solutions that get us from one place to another.
Yeah.
And both governments seem reluctant to open the windows on that so people can see it. We kind of get caught up in the turmoil of leading into silly season and these things.
Yeah.
It's funny, I guess, as someone who's a First Nations, a chief councillor of a First Nation, a regional government representative, do you ever just sit there and say, wow, you all piss me off so much sometimes? Just in your head even?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think part of what I do is try to keep that mask of calmness going. But there are high levels of frustration here and there. And I do find ways to exercise that with an O. But the idea that I try to take forward is there's going to be blocks based on the left wing and the right wing approach to things, right? But there's always a messy middle, and that messy middle will always exist. And it's harder, and it's more frustrating, and you have to pay way more attention to it. It's not pure. And I think that's where governance happens, and I think that's where we have to exist. And that messy middle is where those pragmatists, with optimism, keep working. And you got to find those folks. I do find, though, that there are some realities that we have to really contend with in British Columbia, that every community has what economists call comparative advantages. And those change over time based on demographics or climate change or whatever. And I think we need to take some of those into account and acknowledge that British Columbia has natural resources in a way that other places don't. And so the management of those natural resources need to benefit the people who live in those areas, and it will be there forever. And while we have to manage that, we have to take into account that the way populations and demographics are going, you see concentrations in places that are very far removed from that. And I think that urban-rural divide is a good way to look at it. But when people say rural, they often think agriculture. But it's not necessarily the case on Vancouver Island or up north. It's more urban and resource. And so understanding that we have to build mechanisms to create a level of trust, both on the left and the right, for principled economic development in the resource sector to occur is very important. And how we demonstrate our capacity and our competence and our values needs to fit both of those sides at the same time. And so, for instance, in Huu-ay-aht, we are very reliant on forestry because we're just endowed
trees
with great trees. It's coastal forestry. And so we have these considerations around old growth, and we have considerations around making the economics work. When the treaty was negotiated in Huu-ay-aht, a central economic factor was the First Nations woodlot number 1. Robert threatened not to go forward with the treaty unless he got it, and he got it. But if we're invested in the economy, the rules of that economy can't just change arbitrarily. Mm-hmm. And so when we navigate the concerns that people who don't live on the land have, they need to show some trust in the processes that we put forward. And luckily, we've gotten the resources and the wherewithal and the know-how to do a lot of that work on our own. So we have these integrated resource management plans that we've been working on. If we're not already complete, we're pretty close to completing those things on the forestry side of things. Mm. And we're showing in detail that we can manage our lands in such a way that go over and above the very small c conservative way that the NDP has been moving forward conservation-wise on old growth. They're being very careful because I think they're concerned about political reasons. And the same holds true for the right wing, is that we need to hold true to some of our values and our long-term aspects in terms of the worth of investments. Mm-hmm. That government should be involved in helping long-term investments go along, because it's not just about the term of office or the fiscal year or the quarterly report. That success needs to be built over time. And I think sometimes that gets lost on the right. So balancing those things and understanding that we're here forever and therefore our values are different is very important. And so managing that, you have different conversations with different people. But I think we have to face the facts of the reality of the landscape and where our demographics are and what we need to do to actually make economic opportunity for our people and make some compromises. And I think those compromises are clear, that the communities who are reliant on resources need a little bit more consideration than those who may be in Vancouver at a coffee shop intellectually worried about it, because it won't affect them as directly as they think. And that's a hard conversation to have with people who have all of their Maslow's hierarchy of needs covered already. They have the time, they have the energy, and they have the emotional wherewithal to argue these points till they're blue in the face. Whereas the people who depend on the resource economy don't have the time, often don't have the resources, and are worried about raising their kids and working and maybe upgrading their education. They don't have time to argue the point. So they need people who can. And I think that's what I try to do, try to enable those conversations.
Well, I think you do that in spades. I think it's, really watching the movement of how First Nations, through spatial planning, have really started to declare their interests.
Yeah.
They're not one-sided. Again, it's no secret I'm a proponent of fish farms in my territory. It's provided economic opportunity. It's provided other biological opportunities, investment in existing salmon enhancement that we're trying to undertake. It's, it really fills a lot of the checklists that I need as a government.
Yeah.
But arguing that with people saying, well, how can you protect your territory but then do fish farming at the same time? And we don't have the luxury of doing both in our communities. Yeah. We need that balance, right? We need that balance that needs to be there. And the more people that start to understand that, it'll lessen that rural-urban divide that is going to be wedged so crazy in the next couple of weeks.
Yes.
Like you're heading into UBCM.
Yeah.
UBCM is usually a good litmus test of where that urban-rural wedge is.
There is a weird energy there so far, and so we're recording this on Tuesday, so I'll know more at the reception and talk to a bunch of people I haven't seen in ages, people from, northern BC, interior BC, folks I haven't seen in a year, so I'll know more by then. But it does seem as though that we're at this nexus point of, okay, where is it going to fall? Because everything's so close provincially that people don't know what kind of messaging they should be focused on at the moment and who they should be talking to and whether or not they should hold the cards close to their chest. And part of me is just filled with anxiety about that. And part of me is so excited.
Just to have the conversation.
Just to have the conversation, just to see how it ends up. Because I'm at a vantage point now, and I think you are, and a lot of us are, to see we've gone through this before now. But also, I find it just stimulating to see how it's going to change over time and what different routes we may take based on the politics. But you're very on the mark when it comes to something like fish farms. It's so politically charged. But when you look at it, you can't really argue with the numbers. We've had some conversations with CIRMAC and others. We haven't made any decisions yet. I want to be important and clear on that because I am the chief councillor. But also, we've also seen the way that it's benefited your community. Huu-ay-aht First Nation.
Huge, the social side of that.
The way that they've leveraged those conversations has mattered. And I think we're at a point where technology is going to help us along in that way. But also, I think the way the food systems are going, the way that demographics are going globally, food security is going to matter. I mean, the conflict in Russia, with Russia and Ukraine, isn't that something like 40 to 50% of all the world's grain? You wonder why things are more expensive now? Yeah. So
I wish I was gluten-free now.
How many countries depend on seafood resources just to get their protein? I think we're going to see more of this, and the more we focus on maintaining systems that won't sustain that, I think just prolongs a difficult end. We have to work on solutions that, while not ideal, we may still have to deal with into the future. And going into that future, and our part in that is not huge. We're not China. We're not the United States. We're the Huu-ay-aht First Nations. How can we create some value out of that and share in that value? And hopefully move into the future where we are catching up and keeping up with the rest of the people around us. And so we have to create value. I think that's the one guarantee. We can't rely on the government to provide everything we need. And aquaculture, forestry. I mean, in forestry, if a government says they want to pay us to not harvest, then let's have a conversation about the prices or the costs, about what you're going to actually give us. Maybe we'll decide yes. But usually speaking, you want people to be interdependent and more independent of government. And usually that means they have to do things economically. And if we're going to do that, we got to look at our comparative advantages.
100%. I mean, in the Great Barrier Rainforest, we had to protect because it was globally significant then. There was a lot of international pressure on BC wood products because of boycotts and things like that. And we did all that. And we built a conservation economy. We took a $120 million fund. We've leveraged it into $400 million. We've created 1,100 jobs, but it didn't help our housing situation. Conservation is so important about climate battle and all those sorts of things that we're dealing with. But at the end of the day, purely just protecting things doesn't pay for what we need.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge that I have is like, okay, we spent all this time. I think every nation that's involved in aquaculture has a strategic partnership with some kind of international philanthropic around the protection of the rest of their territory.
Okay.
Because we don't have the luxury of picking sides. We got to kind of just do what we need for our communities. And I think it's taught me that we need to do a better job of explaining why we're doing, how we're doing it, and how we continue to do it to manage impacts and concerns.
Yeah.
Because these people who get caught in the urban rural extremism start using our communities as pawns in that battle. I think of the discussions that I have to have around forestry resources with neighbors. I think about my fish farm discussion with the Fraser River Nations, who were convinced that's why there's no salmon.
Yeah.
And so we've really got to start taking control of the narrative as First Nations, and we almost have to drag government with us. That's going back to I don't really care who gets in as long as you're willing to collaborate.
Yes.
The far left, the far right, it's all in the middle where you got to muck it up and do those things. But what's your thoughts? I mean, after I ran, a few people came to me and said, why don't you start a First Nations party? And we've talked about that for a couple different times.
Yeah.
I feel it would just further almost stigmatize that relationship. It's kind of like, okay, we'll win our 1 or 2 seats wherever we can. That might as well be similar to independence.
Yeah.
I like the fact that really qualified, esteemed, knowledgeable, courageous First Nations leaders are trying to get involved in all the parties.
Yeah.
I'm watching North Coast Haida with great interest because Chris Sankey,
Yeah.
he's a friend.
Yeah.
We've all grown. He's around the same age group as us. He's kind of grown up. He's got his family. He's taking care of them, and he has some visions and dreams that he wants to bring forward. He's working with John Rustand, and they've obviously got some tutelage from Ellis Ross on how that goes. But at the same time, you got Tamara Davidson and Haida running for the NDP, who's worked for ISK and really spent a career in the bureaucracy, understanding why things don't work. And I'm watching that one with so much interest because I can't pick a horse in that race. But at the same time, I'm like, wow, there's 2 really qualified Indigenous people that a lot of people are going to have to really get to know and understand.
Yeah.
What just some of your thoughts on just First Nations getting involved in mainstream politics? We've always been involved, but now we're actually participating.
So participating is one thing. And I think it's very important for Indigenous voices to pick any side and be involved. So I think part of what stops Indigenous people from joining parties is because they don't feel the passion for it. And I've found that only the very lucky few are able to follow their passions or know what their passions are to start. That your passion often grows around what you surround yourself with and involve yourself with. And so it's something where there is value in participating meaningfully and representing your interests and values within a party, because every party in BC is a big tent. That there are voices and factions and groups within each of those big tents that are vying for control. And you can see what that gets really skewed, like what you're seeing federally. I won't get into it too much, but the more involved you are at a party level, the more involved you are at actual making decisions, because the platforms and what governments do, that's decided inside the party. You can scream until you're blue in the face outside of the party, but you will have a limited impact being inside the party, playing the factional politics, getting your policy positions put forward and accepted at a high level takes a lot of work within the party. And a lot of people aren't aware of that. They think that, the NDP is an edifice, the Conservatives are an edifice, and they all lockstep. No. No, they're not. Every caucus, they have factions, they have disagreements. We're just not allowed to see them, which is probably good for their processes. But people need to understand that, yeah, you vote for a party, and yeah, the legislature or parliament argue about things, but the actual decisions are made within the party before the election. And so that's why it's so important. In terms of Indigenous people forming their own party, I don't think that's viable. I think you're right. I think it creates silos and points of departure. And suddenly we become the Bloc Québécois without a land base in the same way, because we're just everywhere, right? And that's not the same thing. And also, I think that from an electoral perspective, it doesn't make sense unless we had some sort of proportional representation. Yep. And then you would try to leverage what the Green Party tries to do all the time. And we should acknowledge Adam Olsen as an Indigenous leader, is that then we could be the pivot on how everything moves in terms of what Indigenous people care about moving forward. And I think in that environment, that would make sense. But right now, Indigenous people who care about their communities and other communities, Indigenous communities, should join parties and represent that. And don't let yourself get siloed within the parties either, right? Indigenous Commission or the Indigenous Caucus. No, just be involved in everything, because they need our voices just as much as anyone.
It's so important to understand that, it's almost just like anything. You got to kind of work at the technical, bureaucratic, and then with the decision makers on that, because you have to have some process in there to kind of achieve some of your goals. I think we've done a better job at showing that, First Nation certainty is a path forward. I look at the state of forestry in British Columbia right now, and while, share prices aren't an accurate reflection of it, the only company that's still prospering right now is Western Forest Products.
Yeah.
They've got the most strong Indigenous relationships of all the major forest companies.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see if other industries will follow suit on that. Other sectors will start to sort of see the light that's saying, okay, we can either keep fighting it or we can put our energies into managing how that relationship and discussions go. And we followed TFL 44 closely for a long time before we bought into TFL 64.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I really enjoyed how, Robert and your team, yourselves and others took to it was a very solutions-oriented approach. While Huu-ay-aht was trying to achieve something for Huu-ay-aht, you didn't really go in there like a bull in a china shop and just, okay, we kind of want this part of it, we don't want this part, we want this part. And I think of the fact that we're both talking to Brian Butler, had the USW a little bit more regular than we used to, shows that everybody's trying to do it right.
Yeah.
We're having some tough discussions. But...
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, inserting ourselves in the forestry sector means that we're kind of inserting ourselves in age-old relationships between government and labor and ownership and management and everywhere in between, right? And then it's different in the different locations. Interior forestry is different than coastal forestry, et cetera, et cetera. I really appreciate the work that Western Forest Products has been able to do. They were one of the first companies that I interacted with that really seemed to understand that the future wasn't just doing the job right and wasn't just handling labor. It was creating relationships with Indigenous communities and trying to understand where they're coming from. And I think where we're coming from now in the work that we're doing as Huu-ay-aht, but also as a part of ISCOM Investments, the 20 nations that are working together, is that we didn't need to demonstrate to our prospective partners like Western that we're trying to understand where you're coming from as well. And I think that's the hallmark of a next level understanding between any two parties, really, is showing that you understand where they're coming from. And it feels really traditional to me, because in our oral cultures, if we were visiting your community, well, A, it would take a while, but B, we would spend hours on the beach introducing ourselves and then demonstrating our connections to your community through our families, through the arrangements, through our agreements. And then we would talk about how we know, or what we know about who you are, what we appreciate about you. Here are some gifts. We know you had a hard time this winter in this, so we bring support on that. But we also know that you're amazing soccer players or something, right? Like, and so all of that traditional back and forth is what we think is the model by which we're approaching the economy and our relationships within the market, within business relationships. If we can demonstrate to Western how we understand them and where they're coming from, if there's some parts that we don't get, they'll tell us.
Mm-hmm.
But we should do as much work understanding them as we are expecting from them to understand where we're coming from. And then when we meet in the middle, then we can talk about the real salient stuff and actually get things done. Because we can't afford misunderstanding basic things anymore, especially if we want to be a part of creating value and sharing in it. We got to create the value. And so I think every conversation I've had with board members, with people who are running those companies, like Dawn and Steve, once they hear us say those kind of things and like we're trying to do this, trying to understand who you are and what you're worried about, it gets better. They lean in, right? They start to realize, okay, they're trying and they're responding to us, trying back. And so I think that there are some sectors in the economy that are starting to follow that suit. I think there are mining companies that are doing well. We've already talked about aquaculture. I think anywhere where the land and people interact is going to be important. Mm-hmm. It'd be interesting to see how agricultural interests interact with Indigenous communities, just given how ALR works and those kind of considerations. I think that's going to be a tough nut to crack.
It's ironic you bring that up because I was just invited to meet with the Canadian Agriculture Council to just even introduce a discussion about what reconciliation could be. So that's hilarious that you bring that up.
I think that's probably the final frontier because it's so central.
Is there a lot of ALR? Sorry, I'm wandering a little bit.
There's a little
ALR bit in the Huu-ay-aht Treaty, in the Monmouth Treaty?
And not in the Monmouth area, but because I'm a part of the Alberni-Clarkford Regional District, the Alberni Valley does have quite a bit of a good history in agriculture and how that interacts with Taoiseach, Ken Watts, and Huu-ay-aht, Brandy Lowder as the chief there, is interesting. I'll leave it at that. It is interesting. But the interface between agriculture being so central to colonial heritage and how fisheries is so central to our own, there's some overlap in some of the values as they're created there. I mean, their heraldry has, sheaves of wheat and cows and horses all the time back in their heritage. In our heritage, our heraldry has orca and salmon and seals and all that sort of thing. And I think there's a parallel there. And I think we can use that as a basis by which we can understand one another and go forward. But I think agriculture is like at a core value. It's something that will be protected culturally, at least in the cultural mindset of Canadians everywhere. And I think it's just something we have to handle with care because it's as important to a lot of their cultural signifiers as fish and the ocean is for us. And so I think we can do it. And I think we're in a good shape to do that, especially given where the world is going with global trade. Our own local food production is going to matter more and more and more.
I think we're figuring out where to try and engage some of these discussions a little bit better. When I know, as you talked about, the Atlio and the Idle No More time, or Idle
No More.
Sorry, yeah. Idle No More time, and just the different approach where we're just trying to break down the front door. Now we're kind of wandering around the building and looking for some opportunities, not necessarily olive branches, but okay, here's a place that discussion can start.
Yeah.
Maybe that'll lead to the door getting open.
Yeah.
But if not, we can keep going the discussion. We can talk to each other through the window for a little while. And it's interesting seeing that. This could go on for hours. I know we're both busy men and we've got stuff to do, but I do want to get a couple other things out just in part of this discussion. Where do you see fit? I mean, Monmouth, Huu-ay-aht, you guys have sort of done what you need to do from a nation perspective. You've collaborated with some of the nations who are thinking similar.
Yeah.
How do you see that approach in British Columbia? And it's always sounding like I'm taking shots at the First Nations Leadership Council. Maybe I am sometimes. It depends what the audience is. But I know our nations have found more success when we figured out what we're trying to achieve and we build a game plan to get that. And to try to do it through kind of a provincial First Nations Leadership Council type I don't want to say regime because they don't have the decision-making powers, all those sorts of things, but we kind of trip over each other from time to time. And I've noticed that with kind of some of the Land Act stuff. And like, I keep harping on the Land Act, but because it's important.
Yeah.
And how it's portrayed is very important. And I wish the Leadership Council would do a better job at showing the work that individual nations are doing through strategic engagement agreements and reconciliation protocols, and more importantly, treaties that are helping identify what land and title actually is. And I guess that's just kind of my ponderings going into the UBCM week, is thinking First Nations leaders gatherings usually on the heels of that. This year, I think it's pushed back to January because of the election.
January, February, something like that. But
when do we sit down and start having that institutional change on the First Nation side?
I think that's a huge discussion, and I think large multi-nation organizations move slower than nations do. So Huu-ay-aht's gone through a generational change. You know, they're voices now who came up under the previous generation, but now it's pretty much us moving forward. And we have a different tack moving forward because we went through treaty. And so that treaty demarcation is definitely apparent in our conversations with the AFN considerations and the UBCIC considerations and even the First Nations Summit. And so I think there's a bit of a game theory and a culture that's evolved around working your way up through those organizations, and it's done a certain way, that there's a whole different ladder of mentorship and understanding and learning, because those organizations tend to be focused on being the one window stop for federal, provincial governments to interact with them. We need some consultation on developing the Land Act or developing our amendments to these sorts of acts here and there. And maneuvering those conversations, it seems to be those organizations put themselves in the place to be the main contact for it, but then governments also search for them. And I think, and I'm still really adamant about this, is that each individual community needs their own resources to manage bilateral conversations about it. And that the federal and provincial governments should be focusing a lot of their efforts on building a diplomatic corps to have meaningful bilateral relationships with every rights holder. That Monoth is created as a society of equals, that we don't do anything as a centralized government, that we coordinate together. And so we're comfortable working through that process because, Huu-ay-aht has a bit of exceptionalism to them, that we do things our own way. And a lot of our laws are written by Huu-ay-aht for Huu-ay-aht. And they aren't often on the template that other Monoth nations have followed. And you can see that in other ways as well. And so I think that there can be change moving forward, but I think it's going to be slower because I think there's an inherent resistance to the way that at least I've been trying to move forward in relationships with government, because it's still seen as a fight at the high levels of these large organizations, that we have people who are prepared for the last conflict. They want to win the Delgamooks and the Sparrows and all of these big court cases that we've already won. What are the next steps? And maybe burning bridges as I'm speaking now too, but I still think that this is the case, that I think we will get more done having conversations bilaterally on behalf of my community than working through a lot of these organizations. We could benefit from some of those conversations, but we don't feel as though our voices will be heard to the same degree, because you have to really invest time and effort in getting into those systems. And once you do, you better have a lock on your own community at that point, because how many people have tried that route and then get booted out unceremoniously, even though they were almost the regional chief or really prominent in these other organizations. So that's a consideration in and of itself. So I have faith in bilateral conversations, so I can tailor them to what we need. And I'm willing to work with mostly treaty nations for the most part, because we have the most in common, but I don't often have very much in common with nations that are taking other tacks. And I don't necessarily understand how Chilcotin will be pursuing their own sovereignty and their own rights and responsibilies.
We should get John on and ask him.
That would be amazing. That would be amazing. I would totally listen to that 4 times. But I only have so much capacity to understand different ways of doing things, and so it's just relying on other people to handle that, right?
But it's kind of interesting that, we both have similar approaches on that. I know I've wanted to kind of build my plan, get my yard figured out. But as I've done that, people like Robert Dennis and Robert Botterill in the beginning side of ISCOM.
Yeah.
ISCOM Investments is a great example of each of us charted our own path, and then we realized we had some significant common denominators that brought us together.
Yeah.
And I think, issues like ISCOM that have been well thought out and built by us, not for us, but actually built by us. I think of the leadership that Robert had to show to the patience to bring 21 different nations, 23 different nations now together, who aren't all necessarily bound together by a treaty or different interests, different jurisdictional aspirations.
Yeah.
But for us to all do our own spatial planning and take our relationships with an existing company or companies and to be able to take that into one voice has been very powerful.
Yeah.
And I've noticed, both you and I have had the luxury of playing a leadership role at ISCOM, but I've noticed as the other nations have come in, there isn't a reluctance to remind people that we all have our own autonomy because we're doing that internally. I think of some of our internal meetings where we brought up some really challenging issues, but then when we stand up to the rest of the world, there's 20 to 23 nations that are standing here ready to make a difference, and these are all the things that we're willing to take into consideration. These are all the things we're willing to talk about on a table.
Yeah.
It's not a preset discussion, but it does have some parameters around it, so it's actually designed to achieve a result, and that's First Nations self-determination.
And I think one thing we need to remind ourselves is when we choose to work together and we give up a little bit of sovereignty, but choosing to give up a little bit of sovereignty to work together, that's an expression of sovereignty in and of itself, right? So when we're working together as multiple First Nations, we're not only leveraging who we are and the rights and responsibilities that we have with our lands and waters, we're doing the heavy work of free, prior, and informed consent. And we're doing a lot of that work on our own so that when we get to the table and go, all of those concerns that you have about UNDRIP or court cases, we've got that handled, or most of it handled. We have a few more things to hammer out that we've discussed, but we want to do that with you in the room so that you see it or whatever. And I think the more that we can do to help do the work of moving forward in terms of working and leveraging what reconciliation actually means from an economic perspective is that we're going to have to look at the legal aspects and the political aspects, but never lose sight of the economic aspects because that's how we catch up and keep up, right? We have to have our eyes on the prize because, it's dollars, it's money, but those dollars, they're going into opioid overdose prevention. They're going into treatment. They're going into, for us, an Aboriginal Mother Center, a mini version in our own community or in our own area. They're going into places where they have a real impact. And so, yes, it's dollars, but they're not going into some bank account in New York or Toronto or London. They're being spent on therapists, on counselors, on early childhood educators. And I think those are the types of stories that we need to be able to tell because we're working business for a purpose. It's not just some game where we're getting higher and higher numbers for no reason. We have real values, real targets that we're trying to meet. And so we shouldn't be painted with the same brush. And I think working together as Indigenous communities with those things in common means that we can speak with a different type of tenor and tone in terms of when we have conversations, not just with government, not just with partners or lenders, but people who will influence decision-making through their public voices, through their organizations and their lobbying, right? We want to make sure that people have confidence in what it is we're trying to achieve and trust. And I've tried to be avoiding this term, but we need to have faith in one another once more, that we're all trying to do the right thing. Like I'm a Carl Sagan guy, so I don't really use the faith word all that often, but that's what it is, that we have to believe in one another again and stop worrying about all this polarization, that we're all here for the right same purpose. And I think getting into that messy middle is going to be the key to that. And, it makes everyone's life better.
I think you're so right. I mean, you said something really that struck me last week is, we're no longer stakeholders, we're shareholders now. And that comes with accountability. I think that's the other thing that we've done a better job at demonstrating is the accountability that comes with these decisions and the ability to make these decisions. And so it's so important for us to keep, just not necessarily providing a model, but showing the leadership. Like, I know both, you and I find ourselves at a lot of the similar conferences, and we're not afraid to stand up and tell people, this is what we develop, this is what we're building, but this is why.
Yeah.
And I mean, I love, your story going back to your dad being a faller and spending your time at an actual forestry camp. Like, forestry's mattered to you since you were a very young little man, and now you're a decision maker within a community, and those values have just grown, right?
That, I think, has helped inform my approach to how things are going. I'm dual heritage. Like, my Indigenous side is my mother's side, right? I have roots in Huu-ay-aht, Clahoose. Should have Steve on one day. But on my dad's side, Scottish, out of Ireland, because they backed the wrong queen, way back then. But they came to Saskatchewan, and my namesake is my great-grandfather, John McIver. He was whatever below a factor is in the Hudson's Bay Company.
Mm-hmm.
So I have this heritage that has a long history in Canada. And for whatever reason, Scottish people out of Saskatchewan moved to Vancouver Island. There are so many of them. I think it's because a lot of war brides wanted climate that wasn't Saskatchewan. But, I haven't done the math on that. But my great-grandfather, after he worked for the outfit, he was a sawyer in Saskatchewan. Then he moved to Vancouver Island. There was a sawyer there in Arrington. The saw yard is still there on Grafton. And my dad didn't want to work for his dad. So that kind of broke the chain. But he joined McMillan Bloedel. And he managed to get himself into a good position working living with his new family in the old manager's house at Northwest Bay Division in Nanoose, or almost at Nanoose. Yeah. And I grew up there. I was, my dad wasn't just a father. In the off season, he was a security guard and a janitor. I played around in the shops. I was the kid who was dumb and chopped down the only apple tree in the whole area. I wanted to be like my dad, and I was so proud. And he's like, he didn't punish me, but he also just kind of walked away. And it's like, I don't want to get in trouble. But I only exist because of fisheries, my grandpa, and forestry, my dad. And so I know the value of resources and what it can do to create stability. I wouldn't be where I am today without any of the decisions that were made, not just by my family members, but by Ted Komodo, or like people going back farther and farther on fisheries and forestry. I wouldn't exist if BC Packers didn't exist. Mm-hmm. How many people should be saying that, and so on and so forth. And so I think we need to understand how things work in BC and where we'd like them to go, but also work towards it in a way that doesn't leave people behind who are ultimately more vulnerable. And I think that's something that I can advocate for, both as chief councillor for Huu-ay-aht, because it's in the Indigenous community, and we're still in a precarious position economically. Mm-hmm. But in the regional district, the Alberni Valley, even the West Coast, there's a lot of reliance on resources stuff there. It's not just tourism. And so we need to look at those things and make sure that they're upheld, because there are real people's lives here. And if they're not asking for help from the government, they're making a life for themselves, and there's no telling what they'll achieve.
I think this has been tremendous, and obviously we need to have you on again. I think we need to get Sean Hatleo here and maybe a Shuckamus, Ricky George.
Oh, that would be great.
Just because people need to hear the stories of these people who are taking these issues on, and you and I are in a luxury position where we get to share our stories a little bit more than some of these other chiefs who are just busy in their communities. They could share these stories more, but I'm not going to lie, I don't pass many microphones. I don't take a chance to yell into a little bit, but that's one of my goals for this season of Rez Dog Walkers, is to just get beyond the actual rhetoric of the issues that we're dealing with and get into the actual issues and what drives us and some of those things. So always appreciate you. You're always a phone call away, and I appreciate that, the friendship that you and I had developed. I was joking last week at that conference that, when Gordon Campbell first started inviting Indigenous leaders to their fundraising dinners, there's kind of 6 of us at the same table. Yep. They kept us on one little table. Yep. It was like the Rez. It was either the Stan Hagen table or the George Abbott table. And now, we get to be main players at all the tables and host some of these events ourselves. And so I just want to, publicly acknowledge how proud and grateful I am for the relationship that you and I have developed over the years. And I just hope, we can both continue to keep kicking ass and helping inspire other people to do it and learn from other people who are doing it better. You talked about some of the Supreme Court cases. It's the 25-year anniversary of the Marshall case over in the Mi'kmaq territory. I think Donald Marshall and Chief Terry there, and how they're trying to achieve things. But we've actually started this network of communication now of people that are mucking it up in that middle. So I think you've encouraged me to go to a few more UBCM events this week and mucking up in the middle a little bit.
That would be great.
Keep gaming, keep taking care of yourself, my friend, and I hope we can see you soon.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's always great to be here. And any chance, any time you need me, I'm there.
All right, brother. Appreciate it. Thank you so much, John, for being on the show today, and thank you for the listeners for tuning in. Save the date for the 10th BC Indigenous Resource Opportunities Conference, coming soon to Nanaimo, BC, June 18th to 20th, 2025. Since the beginning of the conference series, many successful partnerships now exist. It brings significant benefits to First Nations, resource developers, businesses, and all levels of government. BC IROC lays the foundation for future partnerships and benefits for First Nations and the resource sector. Visit www.bciroc.ca to learn more.